right. I think it's not going to be this. I mean, the issue is where we go from here. It's not a topic for today. It's for the next steps after.
Laura, nobody reads documents during
I didn't write it to you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for saying that. No, I've had meetings starting at 8 o'clock this morning.
Yeah, me too.
No. Red brought me a Diet Coke.
Okay. But it's been crazy.
It's not over, but it is only 1:30, right?
It is exactly time to start.
Yes, It is time to start. Okay, as has been so gently pointed out, it is time to start. It's the person walking in the back that, can you close the door for me? Thank you. Wow, that's loud.
Hold on.
There's what? There's room up front. Yeah, that is true. I see the people sitting at the very back. I see
Everybody
you.
can get its table seated.
Okay. So we have distributed blue sheets.
I did.
Did we get a minute taker?
Not yet.
Do we?
Only JavaScript.
Do we have a minute taker?
Please.
It's always not pretty when chairs have to beg for minute takers. Minute taker? Oh, I have.
Awesome. Thank
Excellent.
you,
So we have Martin and Laura. Oh, JabberScribe.
Could you do it in the Etherpad, please?
Okay, JabberScribe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, so with that, okay, is there anybody in this room that has not seen this slide at least once this week? Okay, this is the IETF Notewell. This is an IETF meeting. All of the rules of the IETF apply.
Don't make us build a network with your idea.
And this is our planned agenda for today. Is there any agenda bashing? Nope. Excellent. So first on the agenda is, yeah, that's the end of the slide. We need to go to the other deck.
Use the podium if you'd rather. No. Switch it.
How about now? Excellent. Okay. The other thing, two things before I get started, putting my chair hat back on. I'd like to remind remote participants that there is a virtual queue and they can get in it, and to put questions in the Jabber room preceded by the word mic. That would be helpful. And then the second thing, a personal bit of administrivia. While I am just, so I am employed by the Internet Society. In this context, I am representing the NOC team as somebody who's been on the NOC team for more years than I care to admit sometimes. So none of this is in any way the Internet Society.
Karen, thank you for your many years of participation in the NOC, including long before you became an employee of the Internet Society.
Right. So these days, I think I'm mostly, anyway. So basically the objective of this BOF, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we got to this stage, but was to gather community input on the network because we've been building this network and it's evolved a lot over time. The last time we really had a serious requirements discussion was about 10 years ago, and we developed the beginnings of a requirements document that's up on the website, and we haven't really revisited it since then. And in Prague, we had sort of a NOC retreat where we got together and we said, well, you know, there are all of these trade-offs that we're trying to make as a team, and it's difficult to make those trade-offs without understanding what the community really wants, because of course everything is a balancing act between you know complexity and functionality, simplicity, cost, resourcing, and so we wanted to gather some feedback from you all on what your expectations were and how much you were willing to put up with. So that's the whole point of this BOF. The one thing I did want to talk briefly about was basically the how we got here. How has this network been built over the years? If you go back to when, in the early days, I was going to add the dates in here, but I never actually did that. But years and years ago, the network was provided basically by the host. And so every IETF meeting had a host. The responsibility of the host was to build the network for that and provide a terminal room. And in those days, the terminal room was a really big deal because we had lots of actual terminals. And it was sort of a point, to a certain extent, a point of pride for the host. But then what you get into in that sort of a model is it's a one-shot deal each time for the host. And so every host that's coming in, it's a big risk item, and it is there's not a ton of benefit to that. And people that build and deploy venue types of networks or event types of networks, those networks are a little bit different than your average enterprise network. It has a different sort of set of constraints, a different way that you build it. And so over the years, some volunteers basically started advising the host team. And so you saw some of the same, the network team being the host and the host's equipment, supplemented by some number of volunteers. And then over time, as there was a period of time there where the IETF struggled to get hosts even, and the hosts that they could get were not really interested in the risk and the cost associated with deploying the network. And so it became a volunteer-only team with scrounged gear. And what this actually means is we would, before any event, before any upcoming IETF, we would have to go and see if we could beg, borrow, or steal gear, get shipped in to wherever we were going to be, and we would start building the network on site. And this had varying levels of success over time. And so roughly, 10, 12 years ago, I don't remember exactly how long ago, we had two major things that changed. First of all, we got some major equipment donations. And the second thing was we started contracting out a lot of the deployment of the network itself. So then the model was that you had a volunteer team with contractor support and also donated gear. And obviously the advantage of donated gear was you're using the same equipment from meeting to meeting. And so you develop some expertise in that. You get some, you start developing some tools for how you manage that going forward. And then a few years ago, we had a meeting that kind of went sideways, and we did a little bit of introspection, and we decided that that this network has gotten big enough and complex enough and operational enough that we want to look at staging and more standardized operational practices. So we moved to a model of the volunteer contractor team with advanced staging. So now this set of gear that we have gets shipped back to Portland. Our rack gets set up, and maintenance is done between events, and testing is done, some development is done. And also we built a whole set of management tools and a whole set of tools for configuring devices, and we've operationalized a lot of that and used a lot of best practices. So the model has changed over time, and the resourcing required to do that. And because the other side of this being that the team is not just what's contracted, it's a real blended team of people from various numbers of organizations, and trying to make sure everybody gets the support they need. So that's basically the administrative side of how the network is built. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about briefly was documenting requirements. So there is a draft on network requirements that was posted in association with this. And so where that draft is right now, we're not going to go into a lot of details on that because we have a list of specific questions. But basically, this is a danger with notifications. They come when you don't really want them and you just have a hard time ignoring them. So there's basically the network requirements document has three sets of target audiences. One is the external providers. So it's, what speed of the links, what is the quality of the links that we need to be in, how many do we need to bring in for an event, how many do we bring in, what kind of diversity they have. So that's all about what networks we bring in. The second set of requirements are really about venue selection. What do we need in a venue? What are the characteristics? What types of access do we need to the venue in order to be able to build the network that we want to build? And what kind of relationship do we have with the venue itself? And then the third set of requirements are basically targeted at the network designers, so the NOC. So what kind of network do we plan to deploy, and what are the characteristics of that network? So draft 00 was basically the currently documented set of requirements, which goes back 9 or 10 years now. It's not what we do actually. Draft 01 is an update that represents some of what we do actually, but not all of it. And so where we're going to go from here today is Warren is going to come up and tell you all about, we wonder why you, Warren's going to come up and tell you all about the network that we built here, and then Russ and I will go through some specific sets of questions that we wanted to get. I'm going to say this again when we get to the questions, but I really want to emphasize that what we're looking for here is user feedback, and what we're not really looking for at this stage is designing a network.
So as you're listening to this presentation, I think some things to keep in the back of your mind are, what does the network need to be for you to have a productive meeting to get all aspects of your work done?
So let me get this started. So yeah, as Russ said, we want some feedback on how the network works for you. In order for you to provide that, it's probably helpful for you to know what we actually do currently and how we build it and what all we provide.
Point it to your face better.
Wow, I finally have to lift the microphone. It's awesome. So we're going on an adventure. If folk would like to follow along, there are some stats. Dashboard.meeting.ietf.org has some network stats. Feel free to look at those. This is a screen capture from, I think, last night. So when we first arrive, actually even before we first arrive, we ship out what we call a scout. It's a little Ubiquiti router, physically fairly small. And we ship it to the site, and either we install it when we come up for the site visit, or we get the hotel to install it. And what this device does is it starts announcing our address space. It allows us to test the circuits, make sure the BGP stuff works. More importantly, it also allows geolocation providers to learn where we are. So when you search for like pizza or poutine, you find the local pizza or poutine in Montreal and not in, where were we last time? Prague. It also allows us to start turning up the IETF-hotel SSID, which we use to sort of pivot and build the rest of the network. Whoa, why did that go down one? There we go. That bounced wrongly. So I'm checking the time because I've got a lot to get through. For circuits, we get at least 2 circuits, sometimes up to 5. And these are almost always donated by local providers. So we have a bunch of local providers who we deal with, and they provide us with circuits. We try really hard. What are you laughing at, Wedge? We try really hard to get redundant connectivity. So 2 providers, different providers, 2 sets of fibers, 2 sets of entrances, etc. And up until now, we've fairly much always been doing 1 gig circuits. A number of providers have been offering us 10, but we found that 1 is up until now sort of largely sufficient and seems to be slightly more stable. But I think in the future, we're probably going to be getting 10 gig circuits. The routers we have can do up to 10. Up to 100. We also require that the provider gives us dual stack, so, both IPv4 and v6, and that they will speak BGP with us so we can announce our own address space. That way we can use the same address space wherever we go. For core routers, we currently have 2 Juniper MX204s. This is actually the first meeting where we've been using the MX204s. Up until now, we'd been using Juniper MX80s, or at least for the last many years, we've been using MX80s. The convergence time on those was quite long. As part of building the network, we build everything, and then before the attendees arrive, we do failover testing. It was taking about 25 minutes or so for BGP to converge with the MX80s. Thanks to the new donations from Juniper, it now converges in like a minute or a minute and a half. The core routers are obviously our core routers. They do BGP. For the last number of meetings, we've also been doing RPKI validation and throwing away invalid routes. They also support, obvious services like OSPF, OSPF v3, that are the DHCP relays, do our RA advertisements. We also try in general to sort of follow best practices, so we do things like BCP38. The routers also do passive ARP learning, and if we have time at the end of this, which I don't know if we will, I'll quickly go into that because it's kind of entertaining. Why is it going the wrong way? Can somebody push the right button instead of the down button? Can you push right?
Can I click right?
There we go. It seemed like a really good idea until now. So for switches, we have a pair of Cisco Catalyst 4500Xs, which we run in a stacked configuration. We also deploy around 10 or so IDF switches and 40 or so 12-port switches. The 12-port switches are the little switches that we plug access points into. If you've ever sat in the front row, you've probably seen a bunch of them. We also use them for things like video streaming, etc. Basically, general switches, whenever we need one, we deploy those. All of these we now manage with something which we call Joe's Magic. This is basically a sort of ZTP type system which has been designed by Joe Clark. Hi, Joe. And this allows us to take a new switch out of the box, plug it in, and it automatically configures itself in the right way, does software upgrades, etc. This actually turns out to be really important. We don't just sort of deploy the network once. Rooms often get converted into things like plenary rooms, at which time we have to move switches around, etc. If it wasn't for this CTP type thing, we would have to do that manually. And it turns out that IETF participants often plug in laptops with DHCP servers or something like that on. So having a system which automatically configures itself, learns where uplinks are, etc. is really useful. Is this going to go forward or down? It's going to go down. Can you click the right button? I tested it before using that. So for wireless, we have 2 Cisco wireless LAN controllers, which we run in HA pair. We also travel with a much smaller little wireless LAN controller, which we use both for testing. We also often end up supporting an ISOC advisory committee meeting after the IETF, or sometimes similar type meetings. This is a small little wireless LAN controller that we can leave behind when we pack up the rest of the network. We in general deploy somewhere between 50 and 70 access points. This has a to-do, which I forgot to do. We have, I think, 68 access points deployed for this particular meeting. Yeah, 68 plus a testing one, so. And our access points do both 5 gig and 2.4. We sort of steer people towards using 5 because obviously it works a lot better. The Cisco wireless LAN controllers have actually been really good for us. They've solved a lot of the ARP problem. If people remember the Prague meeting, not the previous one, but the one before that. The one before that, wow, we keep going back to Prague, 93. We were having a lot of issues with ARP because we announced a huge amount of public address space to the internet. and everybody scanning would cause ARP requests. This would cause the wireless infrastructure to send out ARPs, which would wake up everybody's phones. And so people are getting sort of half a day or 3/4 of a day battery life. If your phone now lasts longer than 3/4 of a day, you should thank Panda, who's over there. Say hi, Panda. We also have a whole bunch of encrypted SSIDs. IETF 2.4 only, IETF NAT64, V6 only, NAT64 unencrypted, EduRoam, ISOC. It's a whole long list. Something that would be really useful further on in this path is understanding what people actually want. Which of these SSIDs people need, which of them are providing useful service. If there are any here we don't need anymore, or if there are additional services we should be providing. Moving on to the guest room, I have a bad habit of calling this the hotel network, so I've actually end up calling it IETF hotel, meaning the guest room network. So it turns out, in case you hadn't noticed, IETF participants are weird. Like really weird. When hotels build their guest room networks, they build them for sort of more normal people. This means that they deploy things like captive portals, which do intercepting and rewriting of DNS. A lot of them also do interception of HTTP and do sort of munging to make that direct people to captive portals. Hotel networks also generally do NAT. And of course, they need to do things like filter dangerous ports like SSH. They're also built with a set of assumptions, which is that people will have a limited number of devices, use a limited amount of bandwidth, have a limited number of sessions, and also almost always they have no IPv6. This would make participants sad. So can you push the right button? All we need is an extra button on the remote. So when we arrive, we've been taking over the guest room network.
Tell the secretary.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. So what we've been doing is we've been taking over the guest room network and replacing it with a pair of ubiquity routers, which we call the hotel routers. And this bypasses the hotel's sort of hoteling solution, their captive portal, all of that. In many cases, we actually just get a VLAN before their hoteling solution. And we turn up the IETF-hotel SSID, and we generally provide internet access for everyone in the hotel. We believe free internet for all. Something that's interesting, and people probably haven't run into this, is many hotels have somewhat inventive architectures. For example, one of the locations we went to had 2.4 gig radios, and everything was on the same channel. It seemed like a good idea when they installed it. They're like, we'll use channel 6. Another thing which we ran into, I think this was in the last meeting in Prague, access points on elevators. This sounds like a really good idea. That way when you're in the elevator, you can check your email. Unfortunately, if your hotel room is anywhere near the elevators, the access point arrives and you're like, there's a good signal. And then you're like, where'd the signal go? Also, hotels have fairly inventive physical plants. So we've seen Ethernet over coax. And I don't mean DOCSIS. I mean like a special little box which just runs Ethernet over coax and something proprietary in the middle. Of course, we've also seen DOCSIS, DSL, Cat3 cable. Another thing that's sadly common is we'll take over the guest room network, and it's only then that the hotel learns that there's a restaurant point of sale and their minibars and their thermostats, etc., all use the guest network. Sort of interesting things which we find. We also run a large number of services in order to support the network. So we have 3 physical servers and 3 other servers which we use to build and run the network. We've been using Ganeti and Docker to allow us to sort of, Bob's looking concerned. Okay. You're looking pensive. So we provide a bunch of services, DNS, DNSSEC. We've also been doing recently DNS over TLS. Also DNS64, which we need to support our NAT64. Obviously a bunch of other things which you would expect, DHCP, DHCP v6, NTP. We have a ticketing server so people can submit tickets and we can deal with issues. And then a lot of other things which are more sort of infrastructure or plumbing things like RPKI cache fall into that, TACAC servers so that we can authenticate to our devices easily, etc. We have been trying relatively hard over the last couple of meetings to move to more of sort of a DevOps model, so we can design and build things, commit it into something like a Git repo, and then be able to rebuild and restage things instead of having sort of long-running servers, which we have to keep maintaining. Monitoring, we also have a whole slew of monitoring things. We seem to often end up experimenting with a new monitoring thing and then migrating to another one, and we haven't always managed to deprecate the older ones. I put the slide in because I knew people would have questions. Before we leave, we back up our servers, but before we do that, we make sure that we scrub all PII from the servers before we back them up, and also that way while they're being shipped around. Personally identifiable information. So, logs, DHCP logs, etc. Thank you. One of the main purposes of the network, it used to be just sort of for participants. These days, it's also to support remote participation. We actually have a separate VLAN for the Meet Echo and streaming traffic. We also provide a number of VMs for the Meet Echo system. When there's sort of common or like interesting sessions, it's currently around 60 meg or so of traffic is being streamed from the VMs up to the internet. So around 60 meg or so for remote participation traffic. As I said, the network we build sort of makes the remote participation possible. Meet Echo and Cascadian, the people who do the video streaming, have actually done events on sort of regular venue networks before, but they've only managed to do streaming, not remote participation. From talking to Meet Echo, they think that the limited bandwidth NAT firewalls like a V6 would prevent them from doing good remote participation. And Cascadian folks said basically the hotel network just won't work for us. So I've gone through a bunch of stuff really quickly. You deserve a kitten for having sat through all of this. Here's your kitten. Wow, that was well done. Another purpose of the IETF network is sort of experiments or eating our own dog food. We do these experiments carefully, obviously, and you actually need to get them approved by the IETF chair. So these aren't just things which we do easily. As an example, we ran one of the very early DNS over TLS services. This was made a little bit more tricky than a normal deployment because we also had to do strange things to make DNS 6.4, which we use for NAT 6.4, work properly. We did it for a couple of meetings. It's now become a standard supported service because it seems to be being widely deployed and used. Another experiment we did fairly recently was V6 only, and by that we mean real V6 only. We put the V6 ops and 6-man meetings in a separate area of the hotel, and then we turned off IPv4 on all of the radios near them, so that the only access that was in those rooms was V6. Much hilarity ensued. It turns out that a lot of devices and a lot of things become sad if there's absolutely no V4 network available to them at all. Things like various operating systems were not happy if they could not talk to a DHCP server, things like that. Related to that was NAT 6.4 testing. This was something where at IETF 100, a bunch of people went around on the hackathon and did an inventory of a lot of different applications and different operating systems to figure out how things survive with NAT 6.4. A number of bugs were found. A number of things actually got fixed. I believe that Spotify, for one, at least fixed their NAT 6.4 processing. A bunch of things got made better from this. Final one, just because we're running low on time, MAC randomization. This was something that we did in sort of cooperation with the IEEE. In order to improve privacy, there was a IEEE sort of effort to see what would happen if devices randomized their MAC addresses, potentially at a fairly short time scale. And we did this on our network to understand what the implications in this on switch architectures, DHCP servers, router ND caches, etc. would be. Carlos, who was that? Carlos. Carlos probably has more info. I'm not sure if he's in the room. And I think I have like 2 minutes for clarifying questions, but there is going to be a whole session after this on, which of these services are important, what do we need to do that we don't, etc. You could ask now if you want, but I did it faster than expected.
Hi, Chair Mosh, Osman. So, having hosted the entire life, analog meetings and getting hosted it is extremely hard to build a mass sort of that all immediately. I did see some services out there besides that I probably would not offer. I am not going to use it as a service anymore, for example. I'm probably also not going to use the pension research and stuff like that. So I think there's probably some services there that was running that probably don't need to. I mean, you can enjoy running them, I guess, but I think that you don't be running it to support your own infrastructure and you can continue to operate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a number of these things are just for our own internal infrastructure, like, Git repos and syslog. Those are just for us. But one of the things I should have mentioned on this slide is there are a lot of services here. If there were some of them we didn't need, that would be really good to know, and that way we can turn them off and make our lives easier. Anyone else? Adam.
Actually, I have a question. One of the things that kind of surprised me when I went by is you mentioned that the average. You mentioned that the bandwidth is donated. Mm-hmm. Is that like aspiration, or does that happen every time?
I believe it's happened almost every time. I think we've once had to buy circuits in memory. We had to buy local loops, not circuits.
Clemens, can you use the microphone, please?
I can say. So what Clemens said is in recent memory we had to once buy local loops. The bandwidth was still donated, but fairly much every other time the provider brings the circuit all the way to us, drops it off, gives us bandwidth, speaks BGP. We put their name up on the slides. This current time was TELUS and Metro Optic, and they kindly brought and gave us circuits. So no cost to us.
Thanks, very impressive.
Okay,
yeah, really nice.
I'm just going to go to the virtual queue.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jim.
Hi. So to answer the question on circuits, the truth is that we've basically gone to friendly folks to get circuits throughout the years, and frankly, it's been done through friendships, through folks who are in the area that we have relationships with. But there's always been money set aside in the budget to be able to handle the contingency in case something went wrong. That said, we have had scenarios actually in Korea. We had to buy circuits as well as local loops, and the last time we were in San Francisco, we had to buy circuits. So it does happen. It's not super common, and figuring out a scalable solution that doesn't require someone to have lots of good friends is something that needs to be figured out here.
Go ahead. Glenn.
So one clarification on survey. Great follow what Jim just said is I also want to use site selection of where to go. One of the great pieces of things we consider is can we get circuits donated there or not. So there's sort of a bias in that.
Yeah. It has also been when we do go places, we do often have friends, if we've been somewhere before, we often contact the same providers and ask if they can do again. But it's actually a significant amount of work to get the circuits organized and set up.
Market reference is being part of the circuit and do exchange notes, not what already mentioned, but you exchange notes with other organizations that are doing similar efforts and possibly the same video.
So somewhat with ICANN, I actually have a to-do to put Sean in touch with you. So mission accomplished. Yeah, that was on my to-do list. We should coordinate better to make sure that we can do that. Jason.
issues like stable electricity and water in your room, right? And so those networks tend to have gotten quite a bit better. And some of the anecdotes may be, a bit dated and sort of holding us in sort of an older mental state here. So I suspect, like when I travel most places, I can get great access, and if I'm concerned about getting services, I pop up a VPN. I suspect that might be a viable solution in many.
Yeah, the thing is, that's definitely a point we should discuss that further. One of the things to keep in mind possibly is when you travel, you're generally not traveling with 1,200 other IETF type people who have a different use case. I mean, obviously sometimes that's not true. There are other places where there are lots of usage.
Fair enough, but that's a bandwidth problem, right? That's not necessarily all these other services. Maybe there are.
No, it's not.
Okay.
Yeah, Joel Yeagley. I can comment on that from having run some of these. Yeah, there's a number of funky issues with the architecture of those networks as opposed to just, say, their raw capacity or the size of their NAT box or their residential gateways. So things like configuration issues. This network has a limit on the number of, or the hotel network here has a limit on the number of broadcast packets it's prepared to see. And so when there's 800 devices, which is significantly more than, say, they normally see on a normal hotel night, we lose broadcast messages, for example.
Like ARP.
Like ARP. Yeah, and so what I would say is that I think the assertion that these networks are getting better is actually pretty accurate. They're not necessarily as good as the expectation that is currently placed on the hotel network. I expect that over time, personally, that they will get there, but certainly that is not the case today.
I mean, they have definitely been getting better.
Skull and Jennings, on that comment, I do go to other conferences full of technical people where the hotel networks generally work, and when they don't, everyone's cell phone continues to work. It's not as big a deal as it was 10 years ago. Look, I understand that we have an expectation for V6, and that's probably often not delivered. But to get our job done, which mostly involves sending email and getting to a web page, you don't actually need that. I wanted to ask a question about the bandwidth. I understand that if we offer unlimited bandwidth, that we will use a lot of bandwidth. But the question is not how much we use, how much we need. Do you guys have any tools or measuring or thinking about that? Because like less a megabit upload per person seems more than any other conference I go to is provisioning at, and that includes AR/VR conferences.
So I don't have the long-term graphs up here. We've been getting close to a gig, and that's...
No, I understand you use that if you allow unlimited. The question is what's using all of that? And if you limited it down, like what would happen? At what point would it become frustrating for people getting work done here? I mean, all you need is my IP addresses, so send me your logs and you already have that answer. But why not? I mean, I'm asking for an intuitive feel for.
So I mean,
how much we use when you have an unlimited bandwidth is a useless number. You need to say how much we need.
That's true, but so far we've been getting offers of 10 gig circuits and offers of 1 gig circuits. We haven't been bandwidth constrained at any time. If we had been, that would be a different.
Actually, I view this somewhat different. You guys keep saying we've been bandwidth constrained. I feel very differently. I feel that the bandwidth requirements are causing us to not be able to go to many venues we could otherwise go to. So I feel we have been bandwidth constrained. So that's just my input.
So what I'd like to do is cut. Yeah, it did. I'd like to cut the mic lines, and also we do have a whole set of questions after this, which was meant to delve into it. So this was really intended to be clarifications on what he was saying, and not debates about whether it's right or wrong.
Sorry. Comcast NBC Universal. So one clarification I'd like to point out here is we do have really the two networks, as you said. We've got the guest room network, and we've got the network at large. And as we have this conversation, I think it would be really, really good for us to keep very focused on when we say, well, I really need this massive stuff and stability, and we have 1,200 people. That's true when we have people in the meeting space. We do not have 1,200 people in the guest rooms. And a lot of people are off-site. In fact, rough numbers, we do, about 600 people typically in a hotel, I guess, but it varies. That means about half of our attendees are actually not staying at the IETF hotel. They're someplace else that's not these guest room networks. So keep that in mind as we have this conversation about what you really, really need and what you maybe don't need.
Did you want feedback on the SSIDs or
Not
later?
now.
Not now.
So,
All right, come back.
one of the things Karen's going to say at some point is we're trying to get general sort of high-level overview of what people need, not actually down into the engineering level.
Yeah, Jared again, real quick. Something I said before about the IPv6 on the guest, on the guest room network is when we tried to do that once, I think it was at Nanog, we ended up with all of the broadcast traffic on V6 actually going and taking down the hotel wireless, and the regular packets couldn't actually get through on that.
Yep.
So it's definitely a real operational issue, and something that should come up in other working groups here about how these technologies that were originally desired for the wired network interact on a wireless topology. To the other comment about bandwidth, I know I saw Jim go in and out of the queue. Since most of the bandwidth is donated or functionally free to the IETF, I don't see a reason to limit that. And also, even if we had to commercially get it, the cost per bit is so low. Commercially available, it's let's say less than $1 a megabit, I think is a reasonable number. And if you actually know what the prices are, it's much less than that.
And actually, speaking of broadcast and stuff, we do, actually, Clemens Boxes does a lot of magic to cut down on broadcast. But Clemens, when we're done.
Yeah, Clemens, that's me, Clemens Schumpel. I'm also part of the NOC team. My responsibilities are getting bits into the building and also stuffing those bits back into the hotel network. So most of the topics we've discussed so far touch my responsibility. Again, I have to concur with Jared that getting bits or getting lots of them is not a problem. In fact, we've been turning down people offering us 10G. So this does not limit our venue selection, with one exception that I've recently heard of that I don't know if I can discuss it publicly. Sometimes it depends on the country, and it's not a matter of how many bandwidth, but getting bandwidth into the thing in general, like for instance in China or in that region. But if we get stuff or if we get bits into the building, it really doesn't matter if it's 1G or 10G or whatever. So these days it's not a problem. And with regards to V6 in the guest rooms, that is also not a problem. The biggest problem that we have, both in guest rooms and in our normal network, is the open V4 internet, because we're being scanned like shit from the outside.
So,
and
Clemens,
you've seen
is this a question for clarification?
Yeah.
Really seriously.
It's not a question. I was just trying to get
right.
into.
I just.
Sure.
Right. We do. That is a big problem. Mike,
I'm just saying V6 is not a problem.
Right. So, Mike, did we? We had cut the line.
I'm sorry.
Do you have something really, really quick?
Yeah, actually, one of the things that, as people were talking, technology changes in the available networking infrastructure in the hotels, not just the availability of it, but the transition from B to G to things. What are you seeing with respect to that lag between them and us?
There's not a huge amount I can answer on that, other than people have been upgrading. So, for example, last time we were in this hotel, it was a very different wireless infrastructure to now. So hotels are actually upgrading their infrastructure. It's becoming a lot more reasonable. Sometimes actually kind of driven by us. We suggest really strongly that we're more likely to come back if the network was made better. I think that Prague also, some of the impetus for the standard Hilton we go to in Prague upgrading was because we said, your current infrastructure doesn't really support us. Please make it better.
So now that we have heard about the network, I would like the guys who are in the room that are part of the NOC team to stand up, so you can put a face to the people who actually do all that work.
All the guys and girls in the room. I had a couple quick notes before we start down this presentation. The first one was we didn't actually do a really good job early on of saying, we do site qualifications. Clemens got into that. He does a lot of the work for site qualifications. Jim had done a lot of that work. So we do as part of the venue selection process, go and check out the hotels. So the second thing is we have tried to level up to a set of user-facing requirements. Some of the detailed stuff we expect to, we could have further conversations possibly on a mailing list, and we'll get to that at the end. But I do think we are trying to get here. As a team, we would like to simplify where we can. So we're trying to make our own jobs easier. So we're not, so I'd like to put that out there first. Is, you know, we are looking to simplify. And then the second thing I want to put out there is we are trying to distinguish the difference between, and I think Cullen was getting to this, we are trying to distinguish between the difference of what we want and what we need. And so I would you know, feedback on where that line is would be really useful. And with that, so a couple of basic assumptions. We've already talked about this. We're going to focus on user requirements. We're not here to design the network. Second thing is we do have two sets of requirements we're going to go through. There is a difference between the venue network, which is in all the meeting rooms and those kinds of things, and the guest room network, and we've already alluded to that in some ways. And so we want to focus on that. So question number one. We need a network, right? So let's do it this way. Hum if you want a network.
Hum if you don't think we need one.
Hum if you think that the IETF would be more productive without network connectivity.
We're done.
I have on occasion heard somebody say that perhaps if we turned off the network in a room, people would pay better attention, but that's another question for another day. All right. So this was supposed to be the easy question. So you all do travel. So do you think the network provided by most venues without any enhancements is sufficient? And that probably means no IPv6, and it probably has NATs and captive portals. And what we'll do is we'll have a little bit of discussion, and then we'll try and do a hum at the end of each of these questions. I wanted to use a slider app, but they wouldn't let me.
That's right. We didn't want it.
Jared Mach, previous professional traveler, now current semi-professional traveler. In most cases, including at the large conferences over the years, we've found that the venues have generally upgraded the bandwidth. You know, it's dependent upon the hotel chain and whatnot, but for the most part, it works. And even in the technical, you know, the more technical places where, like, you know, a Nanog or an Aaron or Ripe or something like that, those networks function sufficiently that the attendees are able to get their work done. And they have specifically not taken over the hotel network because there are many dragons in there.
So, Leif Johansson, my experience from other sets of conferences with technical audiences that I'm often dissatisfied with the performance of the network if work isn't being done by a professional team. If that means taking over the network or whatever it means, I don't exactly know. But I do know that when I go to conferences where it's as is, it usually doesn't help me. I don't get enough work done. I can't work sufficiently well. And to the extent that some of these conferences are longer series of meetings, the trend has been for the conference organizers to do more rather than less over the years to respond to the requirements of the attendees. So I'm not sure that this is a good way. Discussing the ways IETF could do less, I think it's going to sub-optimize us.
My name's Tim Shepard. I've been to an awful lot of IETF meetings, and my travel plans often have me staying over Friday night and then flying out either Saturday morning or Sunday, Saturday afternoon, or maybe even on Sunday. And usually at some point on Friday, the hotel network reverts to the hotel's network. And in my experience, at least half the time, it's pretty sad. And it's not that I don't believe it's that the hotel network lacks capacity to and from the internet. It's that the captive portal system isn't prepared to deal with the numbers of people who are wanting to use it. And that's even when probably more than half the IETF people have already left. And I usually do manage to get on, but I usually have to try several times. Sometimes it has kind of just worked, but at least half the time it doesn't just work. And so I think it's the captive portal, and it may also be that they don't have enough internal DHCP addresses to hand out. So even if you don't even get to the captive portal, or after you get to the captive portal and it wants to do another DHCP, something like this. I've tried to debug it, and it's a different weird story in every venue. And I think, maybe we don't need to bring our own network into the IETF, but I think we have to get their captive portal out of the way and make sure, but I can't imagine it's any easier. And we can handle that Friday night, Saturday morning. We're about to go home anyway. But if it was that way all week, I think it would be a real problem.
So, College Eggs, I think for the most part, I find that what I want to be able to do is browse the web and do email, and that those work fine through all the existing hotel networks, 98% of the time at this point. I do think it's worth asking, are there specific things that wouldn't work for us in that? And the Macheco and remote participation was brought up earlier. I don't know what the status of those products is, but I know that all the WebRTC based conference, like every vendor's major conferencing system is WebRTC based, works fine through V4 or V6 with or without NATs at this point in time. So I don't think that should continue to be a problem at this point in time, or really any time in the last 4 or 5 years.
Alyssa Cooper, Cullen sort of stole what I was going to say, but I think it would be useful if people can speak to the things that they would not be able to do, that they need to do to get their work done during the IETF week, under the different scenarios, not just like, would it be better, like, does it make you sad? Like, of course, the captive portal makes everybody very sad. We all hate them, but we do deal with them in other situations, and so I think the more objective, like, I wouldn't be able to do X if, would be useful to make a list of that.
Ted Hardy. And I think the good news is the rest of the world's requirements have slowly crept up, while ours have kept pretty stable over time. And the result of that is we're much more often in conditions that are close to what on-site attendants are used to in other places. I can remember this was not the case. Mike St. John's may remember the size of the circuit, but I seem to remember that when we went to Stockholm the first time, they actually doubled the capacity coming into the country in order to deal with the IETF. Yeah, so it was like 56 kbps additional line. It was impressive at the time, right? So they doubled the country's capacity. Somebody said we weren't Johnny Appleseed, we were Johnny Applesauce. Ate all of the capacity and had to make some more. The good news is on-site, I think we're actually pretty close, but I think the point that Cullen made obliquely is much more important, and that is the ability to have remote participation be effective is going to become more and more important for the IETF as we try and broaden our base, and as we try and make sure that we begin to bring that into things like hackathons and other places where the kinds of interaction are both WebRTC and GitHub and local participation all going on at once. So I'd actually suggest that rather than focusing on local participation, that the NOC team, as it's looking at these, focus on what it would take to make remote participation work for double the numbers we have now, and make sure that if we can reach that with a hotel network, we're good to go. But I'm guessing that if we can't, the delta between what we need to do to make the remote participation work and what we're doing now for local participants isn't high enough to worry about.
Ted, I'd like to follow up on one piece of that. My experience with the Medeco folks in meetings is that the remote presenter does a test, everything's fine, you get in the meeting, and it's Donald Duck, right? And
I'm sorry, you said it was Donald Duck?
That's all you hear is Donald Duck talking, right? The voice quality is crap. And we've seen this several times where that's the case, and when you start debugging it, very often the problem is not in the hotel.
Yeah, very often it's actually on the participant side, right? Because they're trying to watch the thing and send video and send audio. And if they're in a constrained environment, that becomes an issue. But the best we can do in a situation like that is make sure that we're not the constraint.
Exactly. That's where I was going.
Before you say something, I just wanted to, Mike from the Jabber Room, to answer Colin's comment, and this is from the Meet Echo team, to answer Colin's comment, I do agree that remote participation clients can work easily through NATs. Here at the IETF, we deploy remote participation servers at the venue in order to minimize the delay and make it effective. And having a WebRTC server behind a NAT is far from ideal, in my humble opinion.
Colin shakes his head in, I think, agreement or at least understanding.
I just...
Glenn?
Dean, 2 points. First, I already noticed that in this conversation we're having, we're muddling together guest rooms and the meeting space. And as we're going to try to capture the notes from this session and pull out meaningful, like what people really need, that's going to make it really hard. So I think we should all be really, really careful when we say, well, you know, the hotel network went down, the IETF network went down at the end of the meeting. Well, you're actually in your meeting room doing work. That's the guest room network we're talking about. And I also want to echo, I really like the suggestion that we talk about what we really need in terms of getting work done. So when I'm sitting here, it's really awesome if I can sit here and watch Netflix. It's not an immediate requirement. It's actually probably better if I can't watch Netflix because I'm going to pay attention. But email is a critical thing you do need to do while you're here. Surf web pages to get information, to participate in the conversation is critical.
AD is needed too to clear discusses.
Adam Roach, I wanted to speak a little more squarely to the question in front of the room, and I have to say I'm terrified by this prospect because I have memories of Maastricht, where
indeed.
The guest rooms were utterly unusable, and if that were replicated into the IETF meeting space, everything would have ground to a halt. And so I think that the answer to this is a resounding no, but I think there are probably, and this was hinted at, I apologize, I'm not good with remembering names, but this was hinted at by a previous speaker along the lines of there are problems with the NATs, there are problems with the captive portals, so that we're going to have to probably go to the hotels and either vet those ahead of time to make certain they can handle the capacity we're going to throw at them, or we need to speak to the hotels and say, can we bypass these for the moment and figure out some way that we get the capacity that we need.
Bob Hinden. So to answer your question, no, I do not think the network provided by most host venues without enhancement is sufficient. I particularly want to talk about IPv6.
Shocking.
Never
shocking,
get,
Bob. Just shocking.
I know, but apparently someone has to say it. We will, I think, except maybe I've heard in Stockholm you can get IPv6 in a hotel. We will never see this at a meeting. And, you know, I think it, among other, I mean, I actually use it. Many other people actually use it. The message the IETF would be sending to the larger community that, well, we don't even think it's important anymore. I mean, we might as well just roll this up and stop. So I think this is very important that we continue doing this and building networks that support both protocols. I mean, I would be okay with turning off V4, but that's a little early for the rest of us. But, so no, I don't think we should do this. I don't think hotel venue networks are at all sufficient.
Thank you, Bob, for stealing my comment. Yeah, I just cannot get my work done without IPv6. I'm sitting on V6 only network all the time. So I actually do not need to get IPv4 to get my work done. But if you want opinion, yes, some people do need V6 as a primary protocol. So I don't think until venue network without any enhancements can do that, I don't think we shall be using them.
Charles, could you hold on? We're going to go to the remote queue.
Jim Martin, I wanted to expand on an earlier point, which was that sometimes it's not just the bandwidth and that the captive portal is the issue. I'd like to expand on that a little bit in that we absolutely have found repeatedly that the way that those captive portals are set up, the NATing that they do and the state that they maintain for that NAT doesn't scale to the IETF size. And so the end result is that while you may have perfectly fine available bandwidth, that both the forwarding capacity on the portal as well as the state capacity for NAT are exhausted, and you get some really weird failures. And what we found in a number of scenarios, actually, there have been times in the past where we've used the bandwidth of the hotel, but we've basically built our own infrastructure to support it. And despite the fact that we're using their wires and their external link, by putting in serious gear, that is the gear we use is classic carrier grade stuff rather than enterprise style, and that makes a dramatic difference. So when we talk about keeping the venue network as is and using it, recognize it's not just a bandwidth issue. It's largely you're going to run into problems with the state on the captive portal.
Charles?
Yeah, Charles Eckel. So for the hackathon, we've certainly benefited from having special requests met, and the most common thing is just having lots of wired access, and that I imagine most hotels could do for you if you asked in advance. The thing with prefix delegation, I don't know. I'm guessing less likely to get that.
Less.
IPv6 only, we put in so that we could see what happens, what breaks when. So we could, I'd be sad if we had to live without those projects that took advantage of that. So I really want to make sure that we could accommodate that to some extent.
David Summers Harris. So I have two comments. One is just contributing to, what do we need list. So my story was that I joined the IETF kind of just to learn and find out what it's all about, and then got inspired by the whole IPv6 story that's been going on. And then my first reaction was, well, what about my company? Does my stuff work over IPv6? Try, test the corporate VPN, test our phone apps on the various. And if we had been using just the hotel network, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I wouldn't have been able to start those conversations with the engineering teams within my company to say, hey, why don't we do this? And I think that is one of the objectives of the IETF, is not just writing drafts, but also kind of moving the wider community to adopt the implementations of the drafts. So that was the first comment. The second one is, I think the scope of the users' requirements maybe shouldn't be limited to just, obviously the network is mainly for getting work done at the conference, but it has other impacts too. Like you talked about how Prague Hotel actually probably upgraded their infrastructure because of our networking requirements. So it has this kind of impact on implementations, but also it's messaging. Like I think Bob said, like if we drop IPv6 network, then it kind of sends a message that we don't care anymore. So I think we should think about not just the people using a network on site, but also the other objectives that the network helps the IETF achieve, which the IETF already has as objectives, and how do you should probably look at those as requirements as well.
Jason Livingood. I think bearing in mind this is about the meeting rooms, the meeting space, like the venue, not the hotel rooms. I think maybe we're kind of past. I don't know what other questions you have, but I think we're kind of past. Like, do we need a network or not? That's a simplistic binary question, right? And I think it's not really asking the important stuff, which others have commented on a little bit, which is what do we really need, and how are those needs prioritized? What are the most important things to the least important things on that list? Because that's where I think all of the difficulty often is with particular venues and with where we want to go in the future for this network. I think most of us would say, like, yeah, we have unique bandwidth requirements, and NAT and captive port we know cause problems. So I doubt anybody in the room here is going to come up and say, like, no, let's just use for all the meeting spaces.
This isn't the only question.
I know, yeah.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, unfortunately, we don't have the benefit of knowing all the questions next. I think there's a lot more nuanced stuff.
Right. So I was trying to decide whether it was worth reminding everybody that we do have a set of questions, venue network questions plus guest network questions. And I was hoping we could defer the guest room conversation until we got to that section of the conversation and just focus on the meeting space at this point. And with this, I think we're done with, we'll let you two go. We're going to cut the line for this question and then move on. Sorry, unless you have something.
Maybe I should sit down for the more general discussion because I'm not specifically about the meeting. So I'm willing to believe that we have demands that are probably beyond what most venues offer. But I also believe that what we put in is way more than we actually need. Right? And I don't quite know where we are in terms of the spectrum, right? But it seems like we're trying to like painstakingly create this perfect network like it was architected in the 90s, and that doesn't actually exist in reality anywhere else. But at the IETF it exists. We had the hackathon, the quick people table, right? The guy on Jabber that said, I have a local server up here at the IETF, and the guy on the other side of the planet said, I'm sorry, I can't get to it. I said, yeah, you can. It's not netted, and it blew their mind, right? Because that just doesn't exist anywhere else. and so it's nice that it exists, but it comes with a cost, right? And so I'm on the executive committee of ACM SIGCOM, which runs a bunch of conferences, and they're communications conferences. We have students and professors that are not nearly as crazy as we are, but they're not normal either. And we don't pull our own network. But we go to the venue and say, this is a demanding crowd. You might want to get some more bandwidth. You make sure you have enough IP addresses to hand out, turn off your captive portal. And we let them do it, and oftentimes they do it. Sometimes they don't, and then we complain on the first day, and they fix it, and it's fine, right? I'm willing to believe that the IETF isn't quite there yet, but I don't think we need all this. I mean, what the hell is this VRTP server? Anybody know? I don't. Those on the slide there. Do we need one? I don't know. Anyone in the room with a VRTP server in this room? VTP, what is it? Why do we need it? Why do we have one? No. But I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that we provided that I'm sure we actually don't need.
Rob Ostein, I'm on the NOC team, so I'm not going to express an opinion directly to this, but with the questions about could we get by with, or do we require this, I would recommend thinking also about just how painful it is to get by with in some cases. For example, for me, for actually getting my day job done while I'm here, the critical protocol is SSH. It's not actually anything else. I can tunnel any damn other thing through SSH, right? But in some cases, in order to get it done without a real network here, it have to be 3 levels deep in SSH tunnels that get whacked by the venue portal every 3 hours and that kind of stuff. So it's a question of how painful is it to get your job done? How painful is it? How often do you spend watching the person up at the front of the room spend 10 minutes fiddling with the damn projector because they can't get the slides to come up? How much worse does that get? That kind of thing.
Okay. I'm going to interject a tiny bit right here. One of the things that, I made an offhand remark earlier that I didn't, that I wanted to use the slider tool and Russ wouldn't let me, but I do think one of the problems we're going to have through this conversation is most of these questions are not yes or no questions. They're questions where you have a spectrum. And so one of the things to be thinking in the back of your mind is I think after we had some conversations on this, some sort of a detailed survey or some way of collecting better information from the community on, how important is this to you? And you guys are well versed in these kind of things now. You do these IETF surveys all the time. Is it not very important? Very important. So, I think you could think of this as the first pass through these questions, and then you can help us develop what that survey would be going forward. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is remember venue and then guest room.
So, but what I heard, just trying to summarize, is that we need to continue to offer V6. We need NATs aren't the worst thing if the address pool is big enough, and captive portals are a real pain in the butt. That's what I heard. Lots of other important details, but the summary, if you had to put it down in a few sentences. If anyone disagrees with that, please, scream. Okay, the next question.
I was going to say this is the question that might surprise Russ because I put it in. So this I was sort of a, I'm curious. You all know what the rough distribution of the IETF attendees are, and one of the conversations that we often have internally is, are we only hearing from the people that are really verbal, or are we really getting a sense of the whole community? And that's why we end up doing surveys. So what I would like to do is ask for 2 hums. The first one is, do you think you are an average IETF attendee, or are you somebody who's particularly passionate? So question 1, hum if you think you are an average IETF attendee with average expectations for the network. Okay, so then the second question is hum if you are particularly passionate about what you want the network to do for you. So you guys all think you're average. Okay, so moving on to the next question.
What information did this get us? That they're all liars.
Martin Thompson. I'm really only here because I volunteered to monitor this for the IAB. Self-selection bias is a real problem in this room.
Yeah. No kidding.
That's what I was.
Take that with a grain of salt.
Alyssa Cooper, that was my favorite hum I've ever seen at the IETF.
I like to offer that there is no such thing as an average IETF attendee, so maybe that's part of the problem. Like if you've done user requirements or that kind of thing in product management, you have personas of different types of customers that you're looking at. So probably you want to think about like what kinds of people come to the IETF. Like you have the IPv6 folks that are going to have very different average compared to many other categories, right?
Jared Mach. I think the fact that most people in here, or most other people in the IETF right now are not in here, is actually a sign that what is working right now is working relatively well.
Yes.
I think that is a thing. And the few people who are super passionate or who have environments that are really amazing for them, like Jen, who has all IPv6 only and doesn't need v4, I think that's great for them. But I think for the most part, the network and the infrastructure is actually working well, and that this isn't something that is very high on the list of things to do. There's a few of us who've hosted either conferences or provided connectivity before. I'm sure Glenn can comment on that, or some other people who've done this before. But for the most part, this is working well. It works relatively smoothly. Yeah, I don't think we need a lot of the extra stuff, but it's also a good opportunity for doing that. And I think we just need to make sure we beat back the requirements of the people who want to use the attendees here as their captive audience to perform an experiment, because I actually have a day job I need to get done, and I will ultimately revert to tethering off my phone if I have to, if the network is down. So I think the fact that most people aren't here actually is a pretty good sign that, and that only a few people hummed and said, no, I have very specialized requirements, even in this set, I think is actually a very good sign.
Glendine, I want to respond to Jared's comment, because I think you're absolutely right. The NOC and the network we have today is absolutely, there's nothing better at any place. We are the pinnacle, and they do a great job. I will point out, I think there's one of the motivators, I think, for some of this conversation, however, is that we do have one problem that keeps coming back up, and it's related to the venue selection. So I chaired for about the past year the venue selection, or the venue review committee. And so we looked at a lot of the venues that, Jim and the team would go to site visits for, and they come back and they would report, here's venues that looked like they had things. The number one thing that we rejected venues over was network. It was the network infrastructure in the hotel wasn't up to our standards, or network infrastructure in the guest rooms wasn't up to our standards for a variety of reasons. And that meant a lot of places got rejected that potentially we could go and meet at. And that's part of, I think, an important part of this equation as we look through it, especially when we get into places that are not like tier one, big tier one cities in North America or in Europe. We have a lot of problems.
We're going to go to Jim next.
Yeah. So my recollection is different than what you're describing. Having been in that role for such a long time, we did in fact reject some locations, particularly in Japan, based upon network. However, almost always there was a direct correlation between the infrastructure not being sufficient and the infrastructure and the rest of the pieces that were necessary to host an IETF meeting there were not a good fit. And so I can count probably on one hand, maybe two hands, over the last 10, 15 years, the number of sites where Marcia, Stephanie and Laura had said, yes, this is where I want to go. And I'm like, sorry, we can't do it because we don't have the network infrastructure. And also, I'd like to expand on that just a hair and say that it's very common for us to say the site isn't acceptable as is. However, if you do X, and sometimes X is install some fiber, or X is install an additional copper run into a meeting room, then we can come. And that has been successful repeatedly. In fact, we were commenting on the infrastructure in Prague being better. There's a lot of fiber that's in Prague that didn't exist there before, and it dramatically has improved our deployment there. And that was because we said, hey, this is a great place, except we've got this issue. During the sales cycle, we got it added into the contract that they would add fiber, and it all worked out. So I call into question the assertion that we've been rejecting things primarily because of the network.
Go ahead.
One clarification on that. I didn't say that it was the primary reason. So it wasn't like we're to the point that Jim made. I agree with Jim. But when you look at sort of like what was the higher reasons more often, not the primary reason, it wasn't like 99% of the time, but of all the various reasons, the network was very often one of the key or the key reason we were rejected any. Just that clarification.
Lars?
I think we could give the seriously over-engineering our network, right? We could probably provide quite a bit less, and still nobody would be in this room because they would still all be fine. And I think that is sort of my concern, right? It's not that the network isn't good. The network is awesome, right? Don't get me wrong. And it could be half as awesome. It would still be way better than anywhere else I go and travel, and I just do fine. So, I mean, and I have the same worries as Dean, right? It seems to our bar for what we accept is so high that it excludes a lot of things, a lot of places, and it means we always go to the same venues, and it costs money, right? And that's a concern, right? Obviously, I want to be able to, the IETF is the one place where I can run certbot and renew my laptop certificate because it's the only place where I actually have a V4 address that is in that. It's nice. I can do it 3 times a year. Do I need to? No. So I really think we need to look at what do we actually need, like Colin said, and what do we have? And I think what we have is way more than we need.
Hi, I'm Bob Hinton. So I was also involved in the meeting selection. And, I'll most agree with everything Jim said. I mean, the other way to think about it is the venues that were rejected because of the existing network infrastructure, those would be, if you weren't building your own network, that would be the last place you want to go because that network is just going to suck all the time.
Hi, Hans Kuhn, NOC volunteer. Something I think we should keep in mind as we talk about scaling back the services that we offer is that I think that's a good idea. I think simplifying is always good, but we reach a critical threshold where if we don't have a volunteer team and we don't have a contract services team, we're 100% reliant on what the folks do. And there's got to be a certain minimum amount of services that would be interesting to provide, and at which point it's really easy to provide additional services. So some of what you're seeing is the fact that we have a really good team who's here, who finds things that are interesting to do because somebody comes in and says, wouldn't it be great if we did X? And we're responsive. If we're not on site, none of that is possible. And so I think, this is not a binary function, but it does reach a point where you're not providing enough additional value, at which point you say, we're just going to use whatever the hotel provides.
So Warren Quarry, also not volunteer. Somewhat following on from what Hans said, yes, we definitely want to understand what people
Talk to the microphone.
Oh, there we go. I'm saying it short. So kind of following on from what Hans said, yes, we definitely want to understand what people use, what they need, what we're overbuilding. But there is some amount of, once we've got the base stuff set in place, additional services aren't always that hard to add. So sort of SMTP was an example. Once the base network is added, is created, adding SMTP is not that hard. So there's sort of a large hump to get over. Then there's some additional stuff. We definitely have to know what the additional stuff is we don't need. But it's not, one service costs you X, 2 services cost you 2X. There's a base and then an incremental.
Lucy Lynch,
Lucy.
also a NOC volunteer. Two different things on the show floor side. Echoing something Charles said, I come from an academic, research and academic networking background where the stuff that's available is similar to some of the things that we are trying to offer. And I think the idea of experiments and eating your own dog food all tie into that thing that Hans is talking about, the interesting problems to solve, the next thing. I would hate to see us lose that. On the room side, if venue selection really is like a burning question for some people, we have an experiment we can run in Singapore. Venue's already selected. We've been there before. In plenary, we can turn the hotel network over to the hotel infrastructure and leave it that way till Friday and collect feedback.
I think we just had a mic drop.
Ted Hardy, no, there's a much meaner A/B network test you can run. There are actually 2 hotels in Singapore that are connected to the venue. Randomly assign people to the hotels with the IETF network or the not so much IETF network and collect your data. That's A/B network test.
Ted has nailed it, but he hasn't gone far enough. You need to allow people to bid and see how much they would pay to be in which hotel, and then we'd have data.
This is very interesting. When this whole thing started,
Are you passionate? That was the question.
Yeah. So my name's Tim Shepard. I've been to a lot of IETF meetings, and I thought, well, we just had this problem in Maastricht, and then I looked it up. Maastricht was 9 years ago.
Yep.
And I'm fully prepared to believe that hotels have upgraded their networks since then, and maybe their captive portals and their DHCP things are better. But I did have that.
So, okay.
So, and I know you wanted to separate the venue and the hotel rooms, but it could be the same. I mean, I would expect the same issues in that if we just use the hotel's infrastructure and the meeting rooms and had to go through the captive portals.
I'm not cutting you off. What I'm doing is for all of those people going to the mic right now, let me point out that we're only on question number 3.
Yeah.
And so do you really want to talk about how passionate you are?
Yeah. Oh, that's actually. So is it possible for us to figure out whether a hotel's network is adequate before we go there? And I don't know a good answer to that question.
Go ahead, Warren.
So sad.
Yes or no?
So sadly, I don't really think it is. We had something, I can't remember where, but it wasn't that long ago, where we went into a hotel. We told them it was an overflow hotel. We told them there were going to be a bunch of IETF people arriving, and to please upgrade their network so it would be ready. And then IETF participants arrived. The network did not work well, and they kept complaining that we were attacking the network, and that's why it wasn't working. What it actually was just that's what an IETF person looks like. I don't really think that there's a way for us to tell ahead of time if the network is going to survive without having a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. The issue doesn't seem to usually be bandwidth. The issue seems to be captive portal, stuff that wasn't fully understood, weird channelization, unusual internal infrastructure, weird configuration for broadcast settings, things like that. So yes, it's entirely possible that in some locations the hotel network would work. I think it would be very sad if we were to arrive and then discover that it doesn't, right? Because then we're really stuck.
David, this comment probably should be for any guest network related question coming later, but I just want to point out, I noticed that the hotel network here, if you want to use it, costs $20 per day for their cheapest option. And then also if you want to get LTE SIM card, the cheapest I could find was $50. So I'm enjoying the IETF hotel.
I think that there is a difference between, just as a side note, there's a difference between us replacing the network and us negotiating into the hotel contract that access to their network is free. So I wouldn't necessarily look at the cost in that parameter.
Melissa Cooper. Yeah, I think the contracts are actually quite relevant here, both for the case that you raised, Warren, because I don't know if there was a contract with the Overflow Hotel that included anything about the network. So we contracted with them, and they agreed that they were going to upgrade the network, and then they didn't do it. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay. It just seems a little odd to me, like we fly people around the world to do site visits, and then you say, well, we can't really tell in advance whether things are going to work or not. Like, what was the point of the site visit? So I think we can tell something because we obviously take hotels off of the list if they're if they don't meet some criteria. So there must be something there. Anyway, we don't need to continue, but also with respect to the contracts, I would be quite nervous about us having put a lot of effort into contracting for something and then saying we're going to run an experiment and not use it. So like in Singapore, our diligent staff put a lot of effort, presumably, into negotiating with that hotel so that we could take over the network in the guest rooms. And I feel like we should honor that by providing that service to the attendees as opposed to saying, for half the week we're going to turn it off. So I think we probably need to find other ways of experimenting maybe that don't include backing down from the things that we put work into contracting for.
Adam Roach again. I wanted to speak quickly to Tim's point because he referenced the Maastricht comment that I made, and I want to go ahead and throw something a little more time local in. So last Thursday and Friday, I was in a hotel in DC, obviously hadn't been instrumented by the IETF. And I mean, we're talking a relatively nice hotel. It was a Hilton property, the exact one escapes my memory. And the network there, I was getting around 3 Mbps, and actively used SSL tunnels were going down every 30 minutes. I didn't really have time to diagnose why, but I mean, this is kind of my impression of state-of-the-art, what exists in hotels today. Which is why when the question was put up as to whether that would be okay, it's like, no. It's not okay even when the IETF isn't there in many cases. And again, we're talking like nice Hilton properties, not like your Fleabag motels.
Rob Ostine, not volunteer. Very brief response to a different comment someone made. Yeah, I'm not changing the subject. Several people have pointed out that if the network at the venue is screwed up enough, people can just revert to tethering to their phones. And that's sort of true, but there are scaling issues you might want to think about. What it really boils down to is if you're willing to leave the meeting, you can tether to your phone. I would invite you to conduct a thought experiment of 1,200 people each tethered to their phone in the plenary.
I'm Trump again. I just want to get into the can we predict if the network will work or not. So having done several site visits myself and again being responsible for the thing here, I can tell you that sometimes we can clearly tell that a network will not withstand even a quarter of IETF attendees or will work at all. So the negative case is easy to detect. Sometimes we find networks that are fairly well built, like this one in here, the actual coverage, the radio coverage is quite good. Still, after day one, we found a problem that there was something somewhere deep buried in their network that said, no, there's way too many broadcast packets here, and we're going to shut down ports for 4 minutes. And this we cannot predict during the site visit. Site visit is usually a small team, 4, 5, 6 people, maybe at most. And we cannot simulate 600, 1,200, or even 100 IETF attendees. But sometimes we can see, I've been to ones where I can tell, okay, the network is so shitty, it doesn't even work with me alone now, let alone IETF attendees. So yes, we can predict it in a negative case, but not in a positive case.
Yeah, Rick Sauls. What's it cost? Like, what's the incremental cost roughly in terms of people hours, contract negotiation, and then operational costs to have the hotel versus to not have the hotel? I don't know if we have those numbers offhand now, but if it says, oh, it took us a week for people we haven't seen before to give us access to their hotel, or it costs, no extra time, just the more,
right.
Another free bandwidth channel.
So, cost did come up as a consideration in this. So we've started looking at some of the numbers, but one of the things we specifically wanted to do was to ask feedback from the community on what the requirements were and then take a look at this is what you're asking for, this is what it costs, how do they get balanced? And so we specifically, I don't have numbers to give you at this point. I've looked at some numbers, but nothing in detail. But I think the challenge here is the cost between real dollars we pay out versus cost in kind, and then also people resources. And I just think that we're probably better off focusing technically today and then considering in the next steps how to deal with the cost and actually handing it off to the people. I mean, we have an LLC that is established to look at budgets and to look at all of those kinds of things. And perhaps we as the technical team shouldn't be doing that to a large extent.
All right, I'll disagree, but yield the mic.
Well, part of this is where I wanted to look at the sliders of how important is this. You know, if it's easy to do and doesn't cost anything versus, okay, move it along. So Warren
Kamari, somewhat responding to, I think, Adam's point. So as part of the NOC team, we arrived before we started setting up the network. And so for the last meeting in Prague, I arrived and I made FaceTime calls to my wife.
Can I stop you for a minute? I think we've established that the network is improved. Are we going to make a point beyond that?
Yeah, largely. Is it usable at all? I mean, I can do it later.
Okay, it's just we got 30 minutes left.
Can I see your next slide?
So the next one is, do we need IPv6? And I think we probably...
Could I recommend you just show all of your slides so people know what's coming and they can get their comments to the most appropriate place?
Oh, okay.
I'm good with that too.
Okay, so we do need IPv6. And then the next one is, are attendees okay with being fully exposed? And this is sort of the, do you want full network or do you want some client protection? Next. What are your expectations for security and privacy on the network? This is whether you expect the network to provide you security and protect you or whether you are willing to do it all yourself. Next. How reliable does this network need to be? I mean, we have a lot of complexity and a lot of cost associated with reliability, and it's not, how do we manage that? Next. Oh, you did, sorry. How reliable does remote participation need to be? In a sense that there's a difference between the network going in here versus that folks being able to get in. Next. How important is the network to support hackathon and community-driven experiments? Next. How important is to eat your own dog food? I think Lucy alluded to that earlier. Next. This is the terminal room question. Is it still important to provide a quiet space or not with wired connections, the occasional wired connections and power? Next. We're not going to get to this today.
In some ways, we answered some of those other ones have been touched on, but this one hasn't.
Is this your last slide?
No, it's actually
That's the
not.
last venue slide.
That's the last venue slide. And then we have guest room network questions. And this one was basically the IETF hotel or a default well-known SSID. How important is it to you that you arrive on site, you open up your laptop, and you don't have to do anything and the network works? I think we have beat this one to death already. I think we have distinguished between the venue network and the guest room network. And
can I comment on that one? Very, very briefly.
But y'all asked me to finish the slides, so I'm just going to go through them. This is the, without any enhancements, which we spend a lot of time discussing. This is one we have not spent a lot of time discussing because it also implies some limitations. Is it acceptable to default to the regional filtering constraints on the guest room network? And this is one of the questions of one of the impacts of depending on where we go, whether we take over the guest room network or not. And then we're not going to get to more in-depth questions. Next steps. So that's all the slides. They are up on the data tracker. So we are going to skip over IPv6. I think the general consensus is we need it. And so you all have seen all the questions now, so you can queue up.
Queue up. Yeah. Hi, Jared Mosh again. I think for me there's a very important thing to keep in mind, which is that as the guest room access has improved at the different conferences that I've participated in, my need to go to the terminal room and go to a terminal room or a common space and 24-hour access of that space has changed. I suspect there's some room for a slider there where if for contractual reasons, it may be difficult or impossible to take over the hotel network. I remember, I think in Atlanta, there was some property where they didn't want us to take it over and run it with the same SSID or something many, many years ago. In those cases, we can balance, I think, on the per meeting basis, the private space that people have versus going to the public space and being able to work. I've seen a number of people doing video conferences and stuff out here in the common space. It probably would be better if they could do it in their room, but that is, I think, a balance between the environment and, people need to balance their own job requirements. And if IETF isn't their main thing that they're doing, which in my case it happens to not be, sometimes they may have to do that other work. And so just providing the ability for them to get that work done or informing them, no, we are not going to do that. You need to make your own arrangements, and being relatively clear about what we're going to do there. I think there is a slider there, and I believe it can vary meeting to meeting.
Just a tiny follow-up on that. That used to be when we used to not do the venue thing, not do the guest room network. The point used to be that people needed to be able to go somewhere to get 24-hour access. And if the hotel network wasn't augmented and it was a terminal room or it was a space like that, then that was a different consideration.
So on the terminal room, I think the fact that people continue to go there and use it, they're finding it useful. And so I think we have a simple test for that one. You look at the room and see if people are going there. And if they are, it's something that they need. They probably don't need VT52 or VT100 terminals in it, though. And on the other questions, darn, can you flip through the slides very quickly? There's one I wanted to comment on, but I forgot. Oh, on the dog food. I think the dog food question is very relevant. And I think it is something we should continue to do. And we've learned a lot. We continue to learn a lot. And as a sort of a thought leader of how networks should be designed from a protocol perspective, it's very good for the IETF to get its feet wet and sometimes find out the dog food doesn't taste very good.
So Martin Thompson, I wanted to talk about some of the security things here. But you asked the question, are people comfortable with being exposed? I heard someone behind me say, well, you're already exposed. The idea I've been talking about writing a document that basically says if you're on a network, consider the internet threat model as the thing that you're operating with. I personally don't want to have a network helping. I found that in every case where a network is helping, their idea of helping is different maybe from mine. And I would rather that not happen at all, and rather we not spend our resources on doing things like in-network malware scanning and the likes.
So I think you misunderstood the question partly, in that hotel networks, through various mechanisms, think they're helping, and we're turning it off today.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I don't want that happening. Now, I'm not sure that I'm diehard on that particular point, in the sense that I do not want someone helping me from the outside. And I would prefer to be turned off, but I don't think I'm going to hold the line on that one, because that's, some networks do these things. The other point I got up to make was that filtering requirements vary by region, and some of them are more onerous than others.
Yep.
And I don't think that the UK requirements are particularly bad at this point in time, but that we might debate the direction they're going. And I do find that some people find, for instance, the requirements in places like China to be somewhat more limiting. So we need to think about that on a per venue basis.
Jason?
Hey, Jason Livingood, on the terminal room question, I think the era of needing 24/7 access is probably past, given connectivity in other public spaces and in the rooms. But it might be interesting at the next meeting, thinking of surveys, like for everybody coming into the terminal room, for example, like why are you using the terminal room, for how long? Like, are there other spaces? Somebody designed a survey to understand why are they using it, what are their specific needs, so that it's better tailored. Thanks.
This particular meeting, I noticed one thing that was different. People are not going to the terminal room to print their boarding passes because the printer is no longer in the terminal room. it's now at the Reg desk.
Hi, Sean Turner. So I guess I'll pile on the terminal room. I can't even get wired access into this thing, so I don't know what I'm going to do with it, or that, or iPads or whatever. Also, I think there's ways we could gracefully shut it down. To Glenn's point, like it's being used, but we could say like, do we really need it? I think there's a way you could get it to your word. In terms of guest network access in the hotel, like in my guest room, I get back so late. I mean, I'm working, I'm checking my email, but like I can deal with it for a little bit, and if it doesn't work, that's fine. So I really don't think I need access like that, specialized, super fast access in the guest room. I just think I could do without it. And if I'm in this hotel, I can walk down, right? Like it's, if you're in the venue hotel, like walking outside your room and going down 7 flights of stairs is not that onerous. And at the end of the day, isn't it all about how we're talking together or being inside conversations in life? We don't necessarily want everyone in their rooms holed up, pecking away on their keyboards. Like, do it someplace else. That's why we pay for a lounge and all kinds of other access. So I think we could definitely look at getting rid of the guest network problem. Privacy, don't need help.
Yeah.
I'm already trying to protect myself from everybody else. And you're all my friends, and I trust you a lot, but I don't trust you that much.
Just one note on the terminal room. I think we tried to word it slightly differently. Is we're not so much asking about 24-hour access as is it valuable to have a quiet space with power, as opposed to like lounges or sitting with your laptop somewhere.
Funding again. So some more comments on the terminal room. I like this. I like Jason's suggestion. It's a really good one. I don't know why people are using it and what they're doing there. I will point out that based upon the different venues we go to, this venue is awesome. It has lots of public space to sit down and type away at. In other places where we have far less seating, like we'll have open space, but not as many seats, I often will, if I'm in the hotel, I'll sometimes drop in the terminal room just to get a table to type away at. So that's sort of, when we do that experiment, we need to do it over a couple different venues to get a bigger picture because there's multiple factors there. The other factor I think a lot of people may guess on my part why they may be going there is that since about half our attendees or more don't stay at the conference hotel, the event hotel, they might be going there to do some work between working group sessions. It's just an opportunity to sit down and get some work done because they can't run up to their room. And on Sean's point, I fully agree. I mean, even today I was in my room doing some slide stuff, and I went, you know what? I don't need to be in my room doing some slide stuff. I go downstairs, do some slide stuff, maybe have an opportunity to talk to some people that just happened to come by. They worked out really great. I had 7 great conversations that I would not have had I been locked away in my room.
Bill Fenner, I'm a NOC volunteer. I wanted to speak to the outage tolerance question because as things like the meeting materials tool have evolved and gotten better, and as the network has gotten better, I've been very surprised to see working group chairs at the front of the room downloading the meeting materials like as presentations are ready, like not downloading before, not downloading hours before, not even downloading minutes before, is out on demand. And so we've kind of evolved into a place where that workflow works. And if we are going to say we have a high tolerance for outages, then we need to make sure that that workflow is discouraged, that we have to make sure that the presentations get preloaded before the session. And building on that, Bill, I remember a plenary talk that was given remotely, and one cannot imagine having 800 people in the room. And
Plus one to Bill, I totally rely on the network being up. I'm often sending my slides 5 minutes before the session starts.
You evil behavior.
I wanted to speak on the eating our own dog food. I think we need to separate out the hackathon a little bit. That's a somewhat different event that clearly is around the ability to do that and experiment and stuff. But I think that the things that get proposed outside of the hackathon and the eat our own dog food are usually not actually about discovering whether something works or not. It's a marketing opportunity to push a technology that people believe in. And I don't really think it adds very much value either as a marketing opportunity or as a discovery of how well stuff works. I think we should just figure out what network we need to get the job we came down here to do, which is around standards, and getting that done. It should be the focus of What are the tools we need for that? And I don't really buy into this dog food stuff much. Separate out the hackathon, which is totally different.
Jonathan?
Jonathan Lennox. Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned that the printers are no longer in the terminal room. I just wanted to say that wherever they are, those are indeed extremely valuable. I haven't needed them. I mean, there have been times, I don't always need them, but when I need them, I really need them.
Exactly.
So.
Yes, Omer. I disagree on the topic of the hotel room Wi-Fi. I think it's needed, and the reason is that I fall in the category of I need to do meetings in between while I'm here, and here the outside the space out there is great to have a video call every now and then. But if I'm in the hotel in the event hotel, I prefer to go up to my room and have the meeting there. And that comes back to whether the hotel Wi-Fi would be good enough for doing that. And some hotels it might, and others might not. So I think if we would drop the IETF hotel network in the rooms, it would probably result in less people coming here.
Actually, I was coming up to echo pretty much that sentiment, although I'm going to make one little consideration. I'm sorry?
Who are you, Matt?
Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew Miller. Apologies. Thank you. Sorry. I also find myself needing to go to take a meeting that's not here because of other things. Now, do I have to take that in my room? Sometimes I can find another place. If there were a quiet, smallish place available for that, at the risk of expanding this into overall meeting venue stuff, that could also compensate for needing to take over the hotel.
Rob Austin, two unrelated comments. Not as not volunteer, but on the subject of dog food and hackathon and terminal room. Back in the day when we were developing RPKI, there was a small cabal of RPKI developers. And we had literally almost every IETF for 5 years, we would have an interop event, which is just 3 or 4 people sitting around the table in the terminal room, seeing whether or not we'd actually manage to implement the same thing from the same specs. That was incredibly valuable. I don't care that it be called the terminal room. I don't actually need wired network, but there should be some place for doing that. It should not just be the hackathon, because actually sometimes we kind of need to do it on Wednesday. Second thing, and this is as not volunteer, I have a question for the group. Could we please go to the privacy and protection question there? We actually have, even within the NOC team, we have split opinions about some of this. I don't think it's really so much split as just there are a lot of facets to it. I'm primarily a server operator guy. My servers live out on the public internet, deal with it. But it has been correctly pointed out a number of times that most people's laptops do not usually live out on the public internet. There's a question whether or not we're actually doing the community a service by exposing all their laptops to all this. Now, the comments before about you're exposed anyway, deal with it, maybe it's a smaller group. Okay, it's certainly under threat by 800 of your closest friends as opposed to 7 billion people. Okay, so it's a scale problem. But most people's laptops have not been exposed to this in most other environments. And, it's a legitimate question. Should we be doing something about that? I have personal opinions, but I want to hear what the rest of the IETF thinks on it.
Hi, 3 things. Well, to the last comment, I actually think it's good to be exposed because most laptops are in fact going to be exposed because people connect them to all different environments. They have no idea what's there. So they're exposed. So I don't see we should be different. The hard exterior, soft interior doesn't work. Let's see, the next one, the terminal room thing, I don't think it's a network requirement. I think it's the way we provide space in venues. A venue that, like here, that has lots and lots of little nooks and corners and tables and chairs all over the place. You probably don't need a separate terminal room, quote unquote terminal room. But there are other venues that don't have that, where a room like that where you can sit down at a table and work is good. But so I think it's part of how we plan space at venues. And the last one, yes, I do think we should eat our own dog food. I think that's part of the IETF culture. and the ability to do that, to do experiments like we did the IPv6 only thing. We learned a bunch of stuff. There can be others in the futures, and the ability to do that, I think, is important. It's, it's like the hackathon, so I think it's a really good activity to make the IETF relevant.
Okay, we're going to close the mic lines at this point so that after these four people speak, we will talk about next steps.
One of the things I was thinking about as people were getting up here I'm sorry, Mike St. John's, was the question of how many people here are sort of key men and women with respect to their companies, and how much does having a good network here allow your company to let you come here and do the work as opposed to being there. So, and that's both the hotel rooms and here. So, I'm not working for anybody directly anymore, so it doesn't matter for me, but you might want to think about that.
So, sorry, Warren Kumari. So a number of people have mentioned stuff like, the ability to do meetings in their room. Something which I think we often forget is many of us also call our significant others from our room. Sean mentioned, he sits in his room and does email. You have a new kid. I'm assuming that you also, do video conferences with your kid on the cellular network. Wow, okay. I mean, it hasn't worked for me and it's expensive, but works for you.
Okay, so Jason Livingood, two comments. One on the dog food question, and I may take the pet analogy a little too far here. I do think that we are good at eating our own dog food, but it's almost like we're the dogs kept by the king in the palace, and it's super special dog food, and it doesn't resemble the dog food that all the rest of the dogs outside the palace walls eat. So it might be a question of like how premium is the dog food.
Are you saying it's Hunger Games?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm confused myself. And then the second is on the security and privacy one. I think those are really interesting questions to think a lot more about. And this space is evolving pretty quickly, and even user expectations, as we know here, are changing quickly. And I think it ties into maybe the question about measurement data that maybe somebody else raised earlier. It'd be really interesting to see more data about the things that are happening on the network. Is there a lot of C2 traffic? Are there a lot of attacks mitigated? All these kinds of things would be really interesting to know more about to make a more informed assessment. But I think it's probably a really interesting to probe much more on.
I'll try and be really quick. Jared Mach. To Rob's question of, to what extent do I expect my laptop to work if I'm on a fully open internet connection? I've taken advantage of that here. If we're going to do some dog fooding stuff, if we're going to do some of this, there may be some other things that we want to actually look at offering. Somebody earlier, I think, mentioned V6PD. So if I want to go and actually run something, do an experiment, it may also make sense to just dedicate that off on a separate SSID, which I know gets into the engineering thing, which you asked us not to do. But I think there's other areas to explore for this. But I think in general, when we talk about the security, the openness, a lot of us are plugging these devices, connecting them to unknown wireless networks all the time. And that is just kind of the natural state of things. And I have a corporate managed device. It has protections in place to do stuff. Whether or not they're the right ones, we can argue about in the hallway. But that's the case. But as far as working remotely, Warren, the line was cut. I'm picking on you. Sorry. And, as far as being able to work remotely and such, the network here is excellent, and I've had no issues remoting in. And like I said, I've seen people video conferencing out here as well, including coworkers. So as far as being a critical employee, being able to get stuff done, I'm able to do that.
So just a really quick, short response, Jared. I should point out that you and my laptops are well managed. The IETF-Hotel has a whole bunch of people who aren't IETF participants. And so we are also speaking for that. Just a note.
Okay.
We let the riffraff in too, is what he's saying.
So I will say that I had originally thought that we would rip right through these questions and be done in an hour. And I should have realized that that was not going to be the case.
But there were no food fights.
There were no food fights. So, but I don't think we have answered the question sufficiently to help. Well,
That's what we want.
so we're on the what next question. And I think that at this point, I feel like we haven't really quite answered, we haven't provided enough feedback to the NOC to help guide some of our design decisions going forward. I think we've also not provided enough information that's going to help the administration side of the house. So we have a mailing list. And so we have like about 5 minutes to discuss next steps. I would like to think about the concept of using the mailing list to develop a survey that we could then send out to the community, using the mailing list to further discuss requirements, and then any other suggestions in the next 5 minutes.
Jared, is this the meeting venue list, or because this is a
No,
BOF
net
under meeting
requirements.
venue, or is this a different list?
No. There's a network requirements list.
Okay.
NET, it's...
Yeah, I'm just wondering if these two activities are going to be merged.
No, we're going to keep the network requirements separate from the venue requirements. I expect there'll be some communication between the two of them, but there's currently a net requirements mailing list that was set up for this BOF.
So Lucy Lynch, NOC volunteer, among other things. In terms of next steps, I heard pretty clearly that people still have a lot of value for things that are done with the show floor network. I heard that there are a lot of questions about the IETF hotel side, but I also heard some responses to the questions around privacy and security, what protections get provided or don't, and those things that might need to get answered before you answer the question of whether or not you do that. So there's probably staging there. And I want to remind people that when we run the network, we make the rules, and when we buy the network, we buy the network.
Clement Schumpe again. I'd like to have one very quick humming vote from you because you're all some of you have done this for many years, and some of you are new to this. Do you consider a netted IPv4 network still heresy?
So,
Then we I'd just like to get the feeling in the room, because whenever I brought this up, I was shut down with no.
So I think that we should not do that. I think we've.
Is asking the question heresy?
Asking the question is not heresy, but as a chair, I'm not going to let you do a hum. So.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah.
One comment on that question. It's like, it seems like we may have gotten to a point in time where we can use V6 so much that maybe we should just let the V4 be like, really a ghetto. Who cares if it's natted and has shit on the sidewalks?
Right. In case you haven't quite gotten there yet, or in case you haven't picked up on it, that has been a source of NOC team internal conflict. So with that, any other comments on way forward? So I think we will move this conversation to the mailing list and see if we can get some solidity. Clarity.
Hans Kuhn, I have a comment about next steps. Is there any idea about how to communicate to the community as this process moves forward? Will updates be posted to the IETF all, or only to the network requirements mailing list? Sort of what's the best way to communicate with this audience as more information? There was discussion about budgetary issues and meeting requirements, et cetera.
So I think one thing we need to do is, on that mailing list, collaborate to figure out what questions we want to send as a survey or include in the next meeting survey so that we can get more clarity. Surveys are hard. And so getting different perspectives and looks into the way those questions should be asked is I think, one important next step. All right. I think there's cookies next.
All right. Just to follow up on the survey, I think that the real bottom line here is the next step is to collect data.
Yes.
And the way to do that is through surveys, and then also some data can be collected from the NOC. Thank you all very much for your patience today. Enjoy the cookies. Oh, cookies are next break? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
No cookies. You weren't good enough, so you don't get any cookies.